Thank you. Thank you, everybody, for being here this evening. I think we have a rather outstanding program on for this evening. Tom Rafiner has spent many years looking into the area covered by uh, the closing of that area in western Missouri called the Burnt District. And so, without a whole lot of other stuff going on, um, Tom, the screen is yours.
Thank you.
You might want to get back to
Back to there you go.
there it is.
Yeah.
Go
Okay.
ahead.
So I'm excited to be able to share the presentation with you tonight. And it was scheduled for November. And I think this worked out well because I'm able to share a lot of this information during Black History Month. So as Harold said, all of my research for the last 21 years has been focused on Jackson County, Cass County, and Bates County. And during the Civil War, after Order Number 11 was issued, those three counties, 2,200 square miles, were basically torched. And my research for all these 21 years has been trying to reconstruct the history of this area from about 1840 to 1870. So I have a very specific geographic target and a very specific time target. And I often get led astray, but I try to stay as close as I can to those targets. What I want to talk about tonight is kind of an overview of slavery's early introduction into this area, the enslaved community, the enslaved culture, and then I'm going to share some stories about individual slaves at the end. And oh, I can do that way. Sorry, I'm learning how to. I wanted to provide a little bit of background on how I got into this Black history. From 2003 to 2022, I collected enslaved stories as I was doing research on the Burnt District, and I wasn't focused on African Americans. But when I did see a story that I thought was significant, I threw it in a file, and over a period of 20 years, the file developed into a couple 3-ring notebooks. And 2 years ago, on Martin Luther King Day, when I was watching the festivities and the celebration, it came to me that I had all of this African American research in the basement, and it was time that I spent some time full-time researching the African American community and the African American culture in that area. It's a little difficult because everything in that area was burned. And I'll get into, I want to share some of my research process with you. But as a part of that, when I got started, I, in the last 2 years, have reviewed and documented every single master household that existed in the Burnt District. That's right at 1,300 individual masters that had enslaved people on their property. And that took about a year. As I go about my research, I started with the idea that I didn't want to import any thinking about African American community or culture into this area unless I had first-person documentation in letters or probate records or some other official document that an event or an activity or a community existed. So basically, I have throughout the last 2 years followed the concept of a blank canvas. If I can't find documentation of something, I have not included it in my research. Not that it may not have been there, but if I can't document it, I'm just not showing it. One of the things I wanted to share as I started on this, I was reading The Coldest Winter by David Halberstam, and there was a quote in that book that pretty much exemplifies what I've been doing. And he wrote that a writer begins with a certainty that the subject is important, but the book has an orbital drive of its own. It takes you on its own journey and you learn along the way. And that has certainly been true for me. I've had to take side roads in my research where I studied music, where I studied the river system, where I studied Texas history, where I've studied and had to learn about camp meetings on the frontier. So all of these subjects have taken time. They're important. The story of the African Americans in the burnt district. So one of the things that I wanted to prove and identify for myself was there a community, an African American community in the burnt district prior to the issuance of Order Number 11? And by definition, a community is a group of people with a common characteristic or interest living together within a larger society. So I've kind of used this definition as a guide for my research. I think I skipped. Oh, one of the things I wanted to mention, I'm back to one of my earlier slides, was that when I got started on this, I contacted Gary Kramer, and I'm sure many of you know Gary. He runs the Center for Missouri Studies. He's one of the state's foremost authorities on African American history in Missouri. So I asked him to assist me in outlining my research, and periodically I meet with him. And so I wanted to give credit to him that he's kind of been my mentor through this entire process. So in the 1860 slave schedules in the burnt district, according to the schedules, there were 5,396 enslaved people recorded in those slave schedules. And within that, there were 1,296 masters. And I've mentioned that I've reviewed every single master and analyzed the enslaved people they had to try and understand what type of community existed on estates and on farms. So the slave schedules, if you haven't worked with them at all, provided gender for the enslaved person, color, generally whether they were African American Black or whether they were a mulatto. It provides an age, but the ages are approximate ages. When you read the slave narratives that were done after the Civil War, many of the people who had been enslaved really didn't exactly know how old they were. They kind of chronicled their age by larger events in society. Sometimes the slave schedules indicated whether there were cabins. When they interviewed the masters, they would ask, some did and some didn't, are there any enslaved cabins on your property? So that's kind of the starting point that I had for my research. Darn it. Stacy, I can't figure out how to just click. Oh, maybe I click this way. Oh, there you go. So what I've been doing for the last 2 years is connecting the dots. And I am interested in arriving at the stories of individual slaves or individual families or individual kinship relationships. And the slave schedules did not provide names. And at the bottom of this exhibit, I've kind of exhibited, I've shown a picture of how I view this. That when you look at probate records, letters and diaries, court records, deed records, war claims, enslaved people often surface in those documents as an event. And it could be in court records or probate records where they're hired out or they're sold. And then they disappear again. Sometimes their first name is given. So on the right-hand side of the slide, I've tried to provide an idea of where you find names, ages, values, families, and whether they were hired out. And if you look at the probate record line, the second line from the top, you'll see that a lot of times probate records have the names of enslaved people, fairly precise ages, sometimes a value. If it was a family, quite often they'll indicate the members of that enslaved family, and then whether the slaves were hired out or not. And so by looking at all of these individual sources, and it does take a bit of time, you can start to connect the dots for individual people. And at the end of the presentation tonight, I'll walk you through a couple of stories so you can see how that plays out.
Hey, Tom,
So-
before we go a lot further, a question came into the chat from David and Carol Mallory, and they're wondering, what is a slave schedule and is that part of the US Census?
Oh, great. Sorry, I just assumed. Okay, so let me go back up. So in 1860, when they did the federal census, as a part of the census, but not actually connected with the federal census, but as a supporting document, they did for lack of a better term, a slave census that was called the slave schedules. And the schedules were put together by county. And so for each county in the United States, there is a slave schedule, and it lists the masters of the slaves and how many slaves were owned. And on that slave schedule, it shows the gender, the color, the age, and whether or not there were cabins on the property. So I hope that answers the question. What they did was they went to every master and asked for details of the enslaved, but they did not ask for names, which is kind of an issue. So what I have on this slide is the information that you can pull from those slave schedules. So in Jackson County, if you look at 1860 and their enslaved community, what I found was, and I want to add that all of the numbers that I see, that you're going to see on the next couple of slides, are approximations, and they are a best guess of what I think existed in Jackson County when I reviewed the slave schedules. So on the left-hand part of this exhibit where I say diving deeper, I'm actually looking at the slave schedules, looking at an individual master's estate, and then trying to analyze the enslaved that were there to see if there were couples. And what I think I feel comfortable with it, in Jackson County, I found 44 couples. I think I identified 238 nuclear families, nuclear enslaved families. I think, and I feel pretty comfortable, that I've identified 796 fathers, husbands, and workers And I used the age parameters of 15 to 40. And there were 796. Children 10 and under, 1,511. And that represented 38.1% of the enslaved population in Jackson County. I think that what's exciting about this is that when you just look at the numbers, historically, you're not able to get down to the point where you go, oh, there were a lot of children in that community. And many of the fathers, husbands, and workers, especially the fathers and husbands, did not live on the same farm or estate as their wives and their children. And I'll talk about that again in a minute. So I believe that there were 351 instances in Jackson County in 1860 where mothers lived away from their husbands and the children's fathers. And what you see on this exhibit is that a mother that had one child, there are 115 examples of this, where a mother and a child lived on the same farm or estate with no father or husband apparent in the slave schedules. There were 105 situations where moms lived with two children. And as you go around, you can see there are 70 with 3, 39 situations with 4, 19 with 5, and 3 with 6. So this was very much in a family situation, a matriarchal type of society where the families were split with the fathers and husbands living almost always on adjacent farms or farms and estates within 5 miles. What's really important is, and I thought that this was really amazing, the number of elderly enslaved. And you'll notice the ages. I just put a few examples on this slide to give you an idea. But the oldest person that I found in the county, enslaved person, was 95 years old. And they were born in 1765, before the American Revolution, and long before the slave trade was abolished, with African Americans being brought into the United States. And what's important about the number of elderly is that in the enslaved community, the elderly slaves were the connection to the geographic areas where kinship ties had been in the past. And one of the quotes I have on the slide is, the old men were the sages and the old women watched the kids. But the elderly enslaved people brought the history of not only themselves, but they were geographic historians of what life had been like before they had been moved. They were oral kinship historians about families that had been separated. And certainly they were oral generational links. And I'm not sure, I'll just say this, just to make sure everybody knows, but these enslaved people were illiterate. And in the state of Missouri, it was against the law to educate, to teach enslaved people to read or write. So their culture and their community was oral driven. And it's by that, I mean, not just speaking, but also listening. So their information was from listening and then sharing. I've done a lot of work, and I'm just going to show this one slide to give you an idea of what I'm talking about in the community in the burnt district. On the left-hand side of the slide, I've got just an example of a southern plantation where there might be one master and 100 slaves. And generally in that situation, there would be an overseer. And the red box and the cloud kind of indicate that that's an enclosed community. And movement and mobility by enslaved people off the plantation or into adjacent plantations was pretty limited. In the burnt district and in much of Missouri, on the right-hand side of the slide, you'll see that I've got, rather than a plantation, I've got rural estates and farms. And I've got a multiple of 200. And what happened was that when the enslaved community was established in western Missouri, they weren't on a plantation. They lived on individual farms. They lived on estates. They lived with blacksmiths. They lived in some in town. And some are part of white clans. And I'm going to talk about clans in a minute. The importance of this is that the enslaved community in western Missouri in the burnt district was quite mobile. With passes, enslaved men on weekends were allowed to visit their families. With passes, they were allowed to go into town and do business for their master. So it was a much more energetic sort of community, not nearly as enclosed as what you would have found on a southern plantation. I've got to move west, Kentucky bluegrass to the tall grass prairie. Many of the enslaved people that settled in Jackson County, Cass County, and Bates County came from the Kentucky bluegrass area. And there were also enslaved people that came from Tennessee and some from Virginia, but the majority in the 1830s and 1840s came from Kentucky bluegrass. So here's how I know this, and this is what takes so long in this research. When I look at the 1860 slave schedules, I know who the master was. Then I can go to the 1860 federal census, which generally tells you where they were born. You can look at the children to see where they were born. And it doesn't tell you the county in Kentucky, but it does tell you that they're from Kentucky. So with a lot of research on Ancestry.com and other sources, I've tried to track every master back to the county that they left before they came to the tall grass prairie. And you can see on this slide, I'll talk a little bit more in this, but Kentucky's in green and the burnt district is that little red rectangle on the left. So generally speaking, the enslaved people that were brought from Kentucky came down the Ohio River. They intersected the Missouri River down around the southern tip of Illinois. They went up the Mississippi to St. Louis and then took the Missouri generally to Lexington in Lafayette County where they got off. And then they walked into the burnt district. Some went all the way to Independence. A little closer view at Kentucky and the enslaved people that came to Missouri, a lot of them got on board the riverboats at Louisville or Cincinnati. And the northern border of Kentucky is the Ohio River. And the green area is the outer bluegrass, and the inner part of that bullseye inside the green area is the inner bluegrass. So what I've done in my research is I've tracked Missouri pioneers that settled in what became the burnt district back to the individual counties that they came from. And most of the enslaved people that came to Jackson County came from these areas. And they were uprooted by their masters and brought to Jackson County. Bear in mind that this was an oral culture and it was immobile. They weren't allowed to go back and visit. And pioneers, I'm amazed that they were very mobile. They were going back to Kentucky on a regular basis, but not the enslaved people. So when the enslaved people were uprooted and moved to Western Missouri, it ripped families apart, it ripped marriages apart. And one quote that I found about the move came from Carrie Moore, who eventually in her life became Carrie Nation. And she lived in Cass County when she was a teenager. Her family moved to Cass County from the inner bluegrass. And she wrote, there was one colored man my father valued highly and wanted to take with him. But this man, Tom, had a wife who belonged to a near neighbor. After we got in the carriage to go to our new home, Tom followed us, crying, "Oh, Mars George, don't take me from my wife." My father said, "Go and get someone to buy you." This Tom did, the buyer being Mr. Dunn. Then she wrote, "Oh, what a sad sight. It makes the tears fill my eyes to write it." This happened on a regular basis, but most were not as lucky as Tom and allowed to find somebody to purchase them. When they got to the river, it was a new experience for most everybody. And H.C. Bruce, a former slave, wrote, "The most wonderful experience to me was when we took a steamer at Louisville for St. Louis. The idea of a house floating on the water was a new one to me, at least, and I doubt very much whether any of the white men of the party had ever seen a steamboat before." The one difference for the enslaved people is that they rode steerage. They were on the deck, exposed to the elements for the entire trip. So this map is of northeast Jackson County, and the first enslaved people that were brought from Kentucky settled near Fort Osage in what was called the 6 Mile area. Let me explain the 6 Mile area. If you see Fort Osage right on the Missouri River, in the early pioneer days, in the 1830s, there were still a lot of Indians in the area. And the government at Fort Osage allowed pioneers to settle in a 6 mile square out from Fort Osage. So it's to the bottom left of where the fort is. It eventually grew up and became Sibley. But when you read letters and documentation from the 1830s and 1840s, they told people they lived in the 6 Mile area. So that's why I put that on the slide. One thing that it's important to understand is these early pioneers, as I put on the right-hand side of the slide, they wanted to recreate that Kentucky community and the Kentucky culture in Jackson County. The Childs lady wrote, "This is where I want my home. It looks like Kentucky." And Septimus Scholl wrote, "If only a peck, please bring bluegrass seed. I am sure bluegrass will do well, if maybe not quite as well as in Kentucky." So these early pioneers from the bluegrass region of Kentucky wanted to kind of recreate that life in Western Missouri. The problem is that the soil is different and the bluegrass prairie extended well into that area in pioneer days. Now, yes.
Question on this map. I don't see a scale of miles. Is Fort Osage and Sibley, that little square, is that 6 miles or is the whole?
Oh, no, I'm sorry.
6 miles?
That's just where that's just where Fort Osage was. And then Sibley grew up around it. So 6 Mile would be if you were to go from Fort Osage down to where I've got the Santa Fe Trail written in.
Okay.
That would be about 6 miles.
Oh, okay. So about twice the size of the Fort Osage block to the.
It's quite a large area. So I've kind of blown it up here. I should have put it on the map. I just didn't do that.
All right. Thank you.
Uh-huh. So the 6 Mile area, basically, to just understand the area, I'm going to show a picture in a minute, but you can consider almost everything above the red arrows as being in the 6 Mile area. And you can see that there are two important things about, well, actually three. One, the Missouri River borders it on the north. You'll notice the Little Blue River goes right through that area. And then the Santa Fe Trail runs right through the 6 Mile area. And the Santa Fe Trail came from Lexington. Today, it's like Highway 24. If you want to drive it, it's a beautiful drive. The Santa Fe Trail came up, it came through that part of Jackson County and then down into Independence. On the bottom part of the slide, I can't read it on the slide, but I don't know if you can or not. But I put on the slide that there was a place, and pardon my language, but it's the language they used. There was an area called Nigger Hill. If you'll look at where the Little Blue River goes into the Missouri River, one of the largest slaveholders in the state of Missouri was a man named Jabez Smith. And he had an encampment right at the river. And he came from Virginia in 1844 with over 200 slaves. And so the enslaved community that lived here, I just want to mention this because the first early slaves that were brought to Jackson County knew that there was a slave trader camp within walking distance of where they lived. They also knew that in Independence, that was the county auction block. If you got out of line, you could be sold. You could be sold even if you weren't out of line. There was a saying that if you were out of sorts with your master, they could send you downriver. And because you lived so close to the river there, that was a very real threat. So the enslaved community, when it got started here, just imagine how dynamic a world they lived in. They were close to the Santa Fe Trail. They were close to the river trade. They were close to Independence. They literally helped build many of the homes and villages along the river from 1830 to 1850. So the culture transfer that took place, the masters that came from the bluegrass country, they brought their what I put on the slide are aristocratic airs with them. They loved their dogs. They loved fox hunting. They loved horse racing. They hired out their enslaved people. Slave patrols were established in that Fort Osage 6 Mile area as early as the late 1830s, and they used the whip. The slaves brought their culture with them. It was a very singing culture. It was an oral culture. It was a fiddle culture. They were telling tales. They were very superstitious. They participated in thievery, but I need to define the term thievery for you. For the enslaved people, being a thief meant taking something from another enslaved person. Taking something from a white master was not considered thievery. And I put on the slide a term that I've read in a couple places, that they were uppity. By that, I mean they were self-sufficient. They had a great sense of self. They were very forceful in trying to dictate what their life should be like and what their relationship should be like with the white masters. One of the things interesting about the Fort Osage 6 Mile area is that the early pioneers that came, there were several clans that showed up. And I put 4 of them on this exhibit to give you an idea of how influential they were in the enslaved community. The upper left-hand clan was the Hamilton clan. They owned 45 enslaved people. The Hudspeths had 26. In the bottom right-hand corner of the Cogswells, I'll talk about more about them in a minute, had 28. The Childs clan had 61. All 4 of these clans lived in that 6-mile Fort Osage area. And among them, there were 160 enslaved people. And the importance of this is that there was a lot of interaction and mobility in the enslaved community, not only within the clan, but among the clans. So there was a very strong community. I want to talk about one clan just to give you an idea of what the population looked like. This is the Childs clan, and we're looking at 1850. And you'll notice I put that there are 6 farm sites, and they're around the outside circle. So one of those sites, as you can see at the very top, had 11 enslaved people. One, as we go around the circle, had 17, 11, 9, 1, and 12, for a total of 61. There were 31 children under 10. And the children are in that yellow circle, so you can see where they were located. There were 15 women over 10, and you can see the pink numbers to give you an idea of where they were, and 15 men over 10. I use 10 because generally by the time the enslaved men or the males were 10, they were working in the fields. And the women over 10 were already being taught when they were 10 or 11 to spin and weave. And by 12 and 13, they were eligible for bearing children. So I want to talk for just a second about the total, what I've called the total enslaved community. And when you read histories about slavery in the state of Missouri, they usually use the perspective of the master, and they'll say that most of the enslaved people in Missouri, or most of the masters, had 2 or fewer slaves, or 3 or fewer slaves. And that is a perspective on the master's world. But what I want to draw your attention to is the enslaved perspective, because the 59% of the masters that owned 3 or fewer slaves only represented right at 24% of the total enslaved community. So over 3/4 or 76% of the enslaved lived with 4 or more enslaved people and within easy distance of other enslaved. So their community was not defined by the master, but it was defined by the number of slaves that they lived with and near. And this gives you an overview of what that looked like in 1860. In the burnt district in total, as you saw on the prior slide, 23.8% of the enslaved people lived with a master who had 3 or less slaves. And that represented 59% of the masters. And that's pretty common all through the burnt district. The numbers don't vary that much. Cass County's up a little higher at 31.1%. So if you flip that, I'm interested not in the master's community. This is a very busy slide, but I want to draw your attention mostly to the right side where it says enslaved community. So 77.2% of the enslaved people lived on an estate or on a farm with 4 or more enslaved people. So they did not live their daily lives in this little small farm type environment that we're used to seeing. They were surrounded and interconnected with a much larger enslaved community. I want to talk a little bit about the culture. On one of the earlier slides, I talked about the slave culture that they brought with them. The slave culture, you'll see on the left, in the upper left-hand corner here, I put no white entry allowed. There was an enslaved culture that was closed to the white master culture. And these are the quotes I've got above the cloud are, the fox wants to know how the rabbit's getting on. The mousetrap don't go to sleep. Everything good to hear is not good to talk. So there were rules that the enslaved community had about protecting their culture and their community. So they were illiterate, as I mentioned earlier. It was an oral culture with speaking and listening. They told tales. They talked, the tales were trickster tales. They were supernatural tales. The slaves danced, and music was a big part of that culture. On this slide, what I've put at the top, you'll see some quotes. These are quotes from masters in the burnt district. On the left, George Moore wrote, "These Negroes will send me to hell yet." And he's talking about that uppity factor I was talking about, where the enslaved people were not only staking out their world, but they were pushing against the white world. In the middle, Septimus Scholl wrote, "I am pleased here with a large and troublesome family. We have 5 Negro women. They have 10 children, and the oldest hardly able to feed itself." These were very busy farms and very busy estates with all the enslaved women and children. And then on the right, Samuel Ralston. "Last night they gave me a great deal of impertinence. They told me they don't want to live with me. I undertook to whip them." And he did. So you can see there is an overlap in the middle of the slide that I called the shared master slave space, where both of these worlds overlap during the day. I want to now take you into, I'm going to cover 4 specific stories. And one of these, and by way of background, this is my destination on all of my research. Just like it was for my first 3 books, I'm interested not in the macro movement, I'm interested in individual stories. So this is the story of an enslaved lady named Eliza. Eliza, on the right-hand part of the slide, you'll see that Eliza was a mulatto. Her father was the white master of her mother. When she was young, she was a wedding gift to the master. During her life, Eliza had 17 children. She was described as bright and handsome. And bright and handsome is a code word in those days, in the 1830s and 1840s, for being a nice-looking mulatto lady. She was born a slave for life. And when you read the original documents, I can't begin to tell you what the emotional impact is on me to read about a child that is born and immediately placed in a classification as slave for life. Eliza was born in 1805. In 1844, she was living in the Bluegrass region in Kentucky. In 1855, she was transported to the burnt district, and by river, that was a trip of about 725 miles. They settled in western Cass County. And what I wanted to do on this slide is give you an idea of how many slaves were transported. You can see Eliza under the slave cabin on the left. She was the oldest of the enslaved people to be transported from Kentucky to Missouri. And in these days, these were the wolf scalp counties. And where they lived, if you know anything about Western Missouri history, the threats that they faced were not only the fact that there were wolves, but prairie fires in the fall were devastating. I put a snake on here because most of the enslaved people did not have shoes. And there are numerous stories of the fear that the rattlesnakes inflicted, not only on the enslaved people, but on everybody that lived in Western Missouri. So once they arrived in Western Missouri, these enslaved people, and I've indicated the women with it's kind of purple, but it was meant to be pink, circles with the woman icon, and the men with the blue circles and the male icon. So they arrived in 1855 from Kentucky. They built their homes and the farm buildings. They lived within 10 miles of Kansas. Actually, they lived closer than 10 miles. And throughout the late 1850s, they were there when all the border conflict was going on. So the culture that they brought with them, and I'm showing this because I can document it and it allows me to add it to the burnt district. They brought Brer Rabbit's tales with them. And Carrie Moore wrote, "One pleasure above all the rest. It was to hear anyone tell tales." And they told the Brer Rabbit, the victories for the slaves. As I put in the upper left-hand corner, the white master could believe that the rabbit stories the slaves told were mere figments of a childish imagination, and that they were primarily humorous anecdotes depicting the roaring comedy of animal life. But blacks knew better. The trickster's exploits, which overturned the neat hierarchy of the world in which he was forced to live, became their exploits. The justice he achieved, their justice. The strategies he employed, their strategies. So that was part of that dual war world I talked about. But this is very much a part of the culture in Western Missouri. And the music. Once again, these are quotes from people that lived in the area. They love fiddles. I have not told you the good times we had when some of the brown slaves, musical friends, came in for the evening with banjos, accordions, violins, guitars, and tambourines. It was the music. A colored man, a slave belonging to old Jim Holdridge, was playing the fiddle. It was a comical sight. Reuben Smith saw the slave playing the fiddle at a white dance. It was quite common for the enslaved fiddlers to play at white dances. And the singing, the Negroes would sing, and it is a sweet memory for me. No one can sing a child to sleep so soothingly as a Negro nurse. The dancing. Neighborhood slaves visited and partied. Colonel Hurst's darkies came. One of them did the buzzard dance. I passed through a crowd of Negroes playing the fiddle and dancing about the street as though they were possessed. So what these two slides allow me to do is to bring that culture into Western Missouri, because all of these quotes are from people that live there. It's not somebody in Kentucky talking, it's somebody in Western Missouri. Superstitions they brought with them. They talked about a devil with a pitchfork, people basting in hell. I was fond of hearing ghost stories and would, without the knowledge of my mother, stay in the cabin late at night, listening to the men and women telling their experiences. I would listen until my teeth would chatter with fright. Sights in graveyards, spirits of tyrannical masters walking at night, chains clanking, and scenes of hell. So pretty vibrant, pretty visible culture. So I've added on this slide the white masters and the farm that Eliza lived on. So on this farm, in addition to the enslaved people, of course, was the master's family. And they had a big house. And they owned, as you can see, a large population of horses, hogs, cows. They had lots of young children. If you look in the bottom right under Eliza, you'll see that not only were there young enslaved children, but there were young white children. They all played together. So the jobs that were established on the farm, the enslaved women were washerwomen, water carriers, weavers, spinners, housekeepers. This family also had a carriage. So one of the enslaved men on Saturday and Sunday would become the driver and drive the carriage for the master's family. And they did use the whip on this estate. So when the border war ramped up, slave owners in the burnt district started to look for someplace else to take their slaves. And in 1862, Eliza was transported to Sherman in Grayson County, Texas. They went overland 410 miles. It took 6 weeks. So in 1862, Eliza was moved to Texas in February. They started their journey in the middle of the winter. This was a bad winter. They traveled 410 miles. After they got to Texas, the master's family came back to Missouri. So they abandoned the slaves in Sherman County, but the slaves were placed in the hands of other masters, and many were hired out. Eliza was emancipated in Texas in 1865, and then she disappears. Whereas the rest of the story I wanted to share with this because it is a Civil War roundtable. And this is one of the side trips that I took. I actually went to Grayson County and I went to Sherman, and I found out that in October 1862, 42 white men were hung within 2 weeks. And it's called the Great Hanging at Gainesville, Texas. And there's a book called Tainted Breeze by Richard B. McCaslin. I've got it on the slide here. But some of the slaves were detailed to build rude coffins for these executed men. Also in these counties during the Civil War, William Quantrill wintered. So the enslaved people that came from Western Missouri, not only did they have ties back because of their families and kin in Western Missouri, they also had ties with William Quantrill and his group. So this is enslaved story number 2, and I'll pick up the pace a little bit because I've been talking a while. This is the Cogswell enslaved community. In 1844, the Cogswells enslaved community was uprooted in Kentucky and transported to northeast Jackson County, Missouri. Mistress Cogswell was a relative of Joe Shelby. And of course, Shelby settled in Waverly, Missouri, which is in Lafayette County, which is very close to where they settled. So on this slide, you can see that the Cogswell enslaved community settled at Bone Hill. And I put a red dot so you could see where it is. Very close to the Santa Fe Trail. So the Cogswell enslaved were very busy building a community. They were involved in the Missouri River culture, the Santa Fe Trail culture, and Western Missouri culture. And this is what that part of Jackson County looks like. I took this picture off of Highway 24, which is the route that Santa Fe Trail covered. So this is what it's very hilly in this part of Jackson County. And on this next slide, you can see what I'm talking about. On the left, you see me grabbing onto the Bone Hill road sign, and it's up on a hill. And on the right, you can see how far you can see, and you can see what the countryside looked like there. The Missouri River is right on the other side of the horizon in that right picture. And between where I was standing when I took the picture and the Missouri River is a highway that was the Santa Fe Trail. So this estate and these enslaved people were within easy walking distance of the Santa Fe Trail and all the commercial activity that was going on there. This is just an overview of the Cogswell enslaved community in 1850. And there were 10 men and boys and 13 women, girls, and toddlers. So the age of the enslaved people ran the gamut from mature adults all the way, as you can see, one of the enslaved young girls was just a year and a half old. Their household looked like this. They had the sunrise horn. And during the day, the enslaved people, after the horn was blown at sunrise and it was blown again at sundown. So during the day, the enslaved people did the jobs that you see on this slide. They were field hands in the upper left-hand corner. One was a carriage driver. One was a messenger. The women were weaving, water carriers, and washerwomen, and nurses. Inside the big house was a cook, a housekeeper, and a servant. So this was very much a large estate. The slave culture and their individual culture began at sundown. And from sundown to the sunrise horn, they were allowed to live in their own community. And on the left, I've got some possible family groups that existed that when you look at all the people there, if you try to understand and analyze, there are 4 possible families there with the matriarch. So they were able to have their families together, their meals together, their music together. It was a time of tales, sharing, and surviving from sundown to sunrise. In 1855, the Cogswell enslaved were uprooted and moved to Bates County. They moved to Butler. And there were 23 enslaved people that were moved to Butler. In 1861, after the Civil War began, Lane's Kansas Brigade invaded Bates County and they took over Butler. All of the enslaved people were liberated and taken to Kansas, where I put they disappeared because I'd been unable to follow them after they were taken to Kansas. This next story is Larry Lapsley. Larry, on the right hand, let me cover the left-hand corner first. Larry was born in Kentucky in the Bluegrass region. He was transported to the Burnt District, and he also was taken to Texas. He was taken to Fannin County, which is right on the Red River. After the Civil War, he moved to Saline County, Kansas. You can see the arrow. And an individual there interviewed Larry and wrote his biography, and that's where I got this. So on the right-hand side of the slide, you've got some description of Larry. Because of the condition of his feet, I never saw him wear anything but overshoes or gumshoes. He was a genial, kindly man. He was a muscular man, 6 feet or better in height, but slightly stooped. Larry's life, he was born in Boyle County, Kentucky. He was willed to his master's surviving son. He was transported to the burnt district. His brother was brought with him, but his brother was used to pay a $1,200 debt. In 1859, Larry was used to pay a gambling debt. In 1861, he was transported to Bonham in Texas. He was hired out to a distillery. He was hired out again. In 1865, he was emancipated. And sometime between 1865 and 1870, he moved back to Kansas. And during the 1870s, he taught himself to read and write. To the best of my knowledge, he never married. I mentioned earlier that most of the enslaved didn't have shoes, and I take that as a reason to try and understand the condition of his feet. Last story I have tonight is Kitty. Kitty also was born in the Kentucky Bluegrass area, and she was transported to the Missouri Burnt District. In 1844, she left Clark County, Kentucky. In 1844, in October, she arrived in Callaway County, Missouri. In November, as winter arrived, she arrived in Jackson County, Missouri. In 1847, she became pregnant. In 1848, in October, her baby fell into the fire. And you can see that her master wrote in a letter, "We had a little Negro boy of Kit's burnt to death last winter. She went to sleep with him in her lap and he fell out into the fire and burned his face and skull. Then he lived 2 weeks. We have 3 little Negro boys lying side by side since we settled here." In 1848, Kitty became pregnant again. In 1849, her master died. She went into probate. In August of 1849, she was given to the Wallace family. Mistress Wallace was a daughter of the original master. In February of 1850, she was with baby again at the Wallaces. And I just found out last week that in 1854, she and her baby were sold. I don't know to whom. So that gives you a snapshot into what some of these enslaved people went through as they were moved from Kentucky to the Missouri Burnt District, and then others, some of them on to North Texas on the Red River in the early stages of the Civil War. So I put on this slide to be continued. My research continues, and I've kind of just given you an overview of what I'm into. During the Civil War, I'll add in closing that many of the enslaved people in the Burnt District were liberated by Lane's Kansas Brigade in late 1861 and early 1862. So that's for a different presentation, but at least it ties in with what happened in that area during the Civil War. After Order Number 11 was issued, there were also many enslaved people that were taken into other parts of Missouri because enslaved people were not emancipated until January 1865. So with that, I'll close. And if anybody has questions, I'll try to answer. Can I get my picture back?
Of them.
Oh, no.
We lose.
I don't know. Did I lose everybody?
No, I'm still here.
I'm here.
No, we're here. We're here.
Oh, okay.
Hi, I have a question.
About this presentation. Have you assembled this into a fourth book?
Well, I am, it's going to be written down. So I've actually written a history of Harrisonville, Missouri. Gary Kramer has advised me to try and focus in on one town. So I have written, and I'm still writing, a history of the enslaved community in Harrisonville. But all of my research is being documented, and I don't know if I'll publish it or not, but it'll be available. And I am writing it, yes. That's a long answer. I enjoyed the research. The writing is really tough work.
Have you looked at anything regarding the hemp properties over in Waverly, and who the slaves were there, and who they were working for? I remember there was at that time what they call a rope walk over
Yes.
in Waverly,
Yeah.
where they spun twine and made ropes for shipping, and the twine was used also with burlap for shipping cotton. So it was a necessary sort of thing.
Yes, it
that
was.
fed- and it fed into the slavery culture.
Yes, it did. Yeah, for sure. I haven't extended, I have bled over a little bit in the Lafayette County. And I've been forced to do that because a lot of the enslaved entered Western Missouri by riverboat, getting off at Lexington. Also, in addition to the rope walks in Lexington, Lexington also had slave traders, and they had a quite active auction block. So some of the enslaved people that were auctioned off were taken to Lexington. But I haven't gone into Lafayette County in a lot of detail. I have read a lot about Joe Shelby's activities in the hemp industry and the enslaved people that he had, largely because he's a good representative of the bluegrass culture they brought with them.
I
Hey,
remember he
Kevin
was a
has,
he
Evan
was a
Smith,
Go ahead. Go ahead. I'll shut up now.
Evan Smith has his hand up to ask a question. Evan, would you like to unmute?
Sure. Tom, I
Yeah,
was wondering,
hey, Stacy, can you tell me how I can get the pictures back up? Of
gallery
everybody.
view, I think.
Stacy, can you tell him how to unshare or, stop sharing his screen? I think that's what he's looking for.
Yeah. Yeah, I just like to see everybody.
I've got an observation, not really related to the talk, but as you see, there was a movement from the burnt district into Texas. Well, there was a similar movement during the Civil War from Virginia to Louisiana. And one of my, that's my part of the country. But one of the famous plantations in Virginia that moved people, slaves, literally downriver, is the plantation name was Lafourche, which is a French name, which is a little unusual for Virginia. But if you go to Louisiana, there's a famous part of the Mississippi River called Bayou Lafourche. And so there must have been connections between plantations in Louisiana and plantations in Virginia. And of course, I have done a little genealogy on the Pochets, and we were slave holders in Louisiana. And there are numerous stories that relatives told me about things happening to slaves that were a little unusual, I'd say.
Hmm.
And have you done any research even farther back historically? Where did these family groups come from in terms of beyond Kentucky? Were they obviously they must have been from the East Coast somewhere, and beyond that into Africa? Have you seen anything that would indicate to you some of those sources? Maybe in the trickster stories or something like that that would perhaps indicate what part of Africa they came from.
I have not,
Oh, that's weird.
yeah. It's an excellent comment. I'm looking for that, but I have not found yet a specific example of the enslaved people, especially the elderly that I showed on that slide. My gut tells me that many of those elderly enslaved came from Virginia to Kentucky and then later to Missouri. Because that's the way the families came. And the state of Virginia in the early 1830s, late 1820s, began to hemorrhage people. And a lot of those, as I talked about in my Peyton book, were on the National Road and came west. A lot of them ended up in Kentucky. So I'm sure the slaves came with them. But I have not been able to prove that. It's just an assumption, and I think it's pretty solid, but it's very difficult to track an individual enslaved family from Virginia to Kentucky to Missouri.
Yeah, you probably have to do it, genetically rather than with paper.
I agree. Yes.
Okay, let's get to Evan's question.
Yeah, I was going to ask Tom, you mentioned at least one slave named Septimus.
Yeah.
Do you know if masters in Missouri or anywhere else were deliberately trying to imply anything by giving them Roman names? Were they ennobling them or looking down on them or connecting them to Carthaginians or anything like that?
Actually, Septimus was the master. If I
I'm
led you
sorry.
to believe
Okay.
that was the enslaved person, I was wrong.
Well, okay, but there were slaves with Roman names,
Oh,
right?
absolutely.
Yeah,
Yes.
yeah. Was there
Yeah,
anything
no.
meant?
Yeah.
Did the
In fact,
masters mean anything by it? And did the slaves know they had classical names?
well, they knew what their names were, but I don't know if they knew they were classical names.
Yeah.
Names are, it's like, to be honest with you, the names are a riddle. And it was not unusual for enslaved people to have a name that their master may have given them that they used when those two cultures overlapped, but they had their own name, a different name within the enslaved community. I've seen evidence of that. After the Civil War, I've seen evidence of the same individual changing their name 2 or 3 times. It is it's a shell game to try and follow some of the enslaved people by name. I mean, it's just, there aren't that many names. I've been building a database with names, but I can't, Evan, your question is, I don't know. I know there were classical, I know of one slave that was named Plato. Now, why they named a slave Plato, I have no idea.
What about,
Are there other questions?
what, yeah, yes. I'm still intrigued by this. What about, church services? Were there religious services provided for the slaves, or did they more or less do their thing and jump over brooms and things like that?
So here's what happened and once again, I just want to make sure that I clarify that I'm talking just about these counties. There were in the 1830s, 40s, and 50s, these big religious events, and they were held all over Missouri, but I know they were in Western Missouri too. And they were called camp meetings, and they would last 4 or 5 days. And sometimes 2 or 3 different denominations would get together to have one camp meeting. And the enslaved, the masters were encouraged to bring their slaves. And they participated in these camp meetings. They weren't allowed to sit with the whites, but they were given their own area, and they were allowed to listen to the sermons that were given. They participated in the singing. And from what I've read, sometimes, the method of song was much different between the white pioneers and the enslaved. The dancing that the white pioneers participated in was much different than the dancing that the enslaved people did. So I've read accounts where these camp meetings were a little raucous and a little different. And in some of the churches, now that's one religious event, as they built churches, I have found evidence that enslaved people in some churches were invited into the church, and they became members of the church, and they were identified by name, and in some cases as being the enslaved of a particular master. In the one family, in Eliza's family, I know that their master called them in on Sunday nights and read the Bible to them. There were also African-American preachers that were allowed sometimes with white oversight to meet with enslaved people, and they gave sermons, but never on their own, always with white oversight.
With respect to names, I know that after the Civil War, when the slaves were emancipated, they frequently took the master's name as their family name.
Sometimes. I guess the one thing that I agree that happened, but to use the term frequently, I have not seen that.
Huh.
So sometimes, to maintain their family, the enslaved kinship relationships, they would often take the surname of their parents' master. of their dads, because the families were split, to maintain a connection. I've seen evidence that they would take their father's master's surname.
Huh.
Sometimes they did keep their, their master's surname, but it's not as often as it's not as often as I thought it would be when I started my research.
Other
And I can get,
questions?
let me add one more thing about that. So when Lane's Kansas Brigade went through Western Missouri and they liberated slaves, there were several hundred slaves that they took to Fort Scott, Kansas. When they got them to Kansas, they were encouraged by the
Did you
abolitionists
say why all those white men were
to
hung?
take Christian
I
names.
wanted to ask that. Wow.
Okay, I'm quiet. Was there no?
Sharon had a
I think
question.
I think Mike Devaney is trying to get your attention to ask a
Yes.
question.
Dave, could you comment on how the emancipated blacks, this is after the Civil War was over, how were they received by the communities in the Burnet district and then the non-black communities in the Negro district, and how were their descendants received?
Well, first I've got to tell you, I haven't started to move into that period in detail yet, but I do know that the Ku Klux Klan was active in Bates County.
Yeah.
And in St. Clair County. I would imagine in Cass. The political leaders in Kansas City and Independence were not open to blacks. And in 1868, all three of those counties voted against giving blacks the vote. So it wasn't a welcoming environment. But to be honest, in 1870, with the exception of Kansas City and Independence, there weren't that many African Americans in the rural areas. They were mostly in the cities.
Thank you.
Okay, Sharon had a question. Sharon, are you still out
Yeah,
there?
you mentioned the 42, I think you said, white men that were hung in the county down by the Red River in Texas. Was that for
Yeah.
some reason related to the black slaves being moved down there, or is it just something you mentioned in passing?
I mentioned it in passing because I thought the round table would be, I didn't know anything about this until I went down there. And what it was, in a nutshell, was the Unionists and the Confederates were at odds. And the Confederates in that area thought that the Unionists were getting ready to lead a revolt. So they arrested like 200 men. And they had these courts and they convicted 42 of them and they hung them within like 2 weeks.
Okay, so they were Union men.
Yeah, the men that were hung were suspected Unionists.
Okay.
This was prior to the war.
No, it was in 1860, October of 1862.
That's when things are really taking off and starting to fight.
Yeah, I mean, that was pretty ugly, I thought.
Well, the thing of it was, in the West, things got really nasty right after the war again, all over, even though it had started as early as 1854 with the Bascom affair and the Apache things went straight to hell after that, and we didn't achieve any peace with the Indians until 1877 in the Southwest.
Yeah,
I mean, it was a longer war than the Civil War.
yeah,
And what ended up is even worse. You know, there were a lot of things that were done poorly by the United States side, and there was a lot of you know, bad blood for many years, to where the American Indian didn't even vote in this country until 1948.
yeah.
That's a crime there.
Hey, Tom, a
Okay, we're wandering
question
a little
has,
bit off
uh,
topic here.
Tom, a
But-
question has popped up in the chat asking, from Wayne Merrill, were they able to legally marry?
Well, in 1865, the Missouri Assembly passed a law that African Americans who had been living under, as a married couple, they were required to get married. So one of the good things about that law is that if you look at the marriage records from like 1865 to 1870, you can see the African Americans that married. You can also see their children, because in many cases, at least in Jackson County and Cass County, when they got married, they also listed the names of the children. So.
More questions? Okay, in March, David Mallory is going to do a program on music. David, do you want to do a little teaser before we sign off?
I would only say, my guess is it would be a better presentation in person, but I realize our capacity is small where we meet. So you're welcome, those of us who ordinarily come on Zoom anyway, you're welcome to be on Zoom or in person.
Is Carol going to sing?
Nope. You're gonna sing?
No, I'm not saying.
Nope.
I just thought I'd ask. Anything else?